conference in Durham, New Hampshire, and you are visiting all the way from
New Brunswick,
New
in Canada.
Brunswick. That's how long did it take you to get here?
Oh, it was only about 7 hours.
Okay. And now you're an avid cyclist, but
Yes,
you
I am.
didn't cycle down here, right?
No, because I was just out to Vancouver for a month, and I was studying and cycling out there, so I didn't have the time.
Just out of curiosity, have you ever crossed the international border on a bicycle?
Oh, yes.
So it is something you can do. It's not something that
Oh, yes.
you have to be in an automobile
Yeah,
to cross.
Actually, I just crossed it last summer because I cycled across Canada on my own, and I dipped down to Washington State and dipped back in. And I've crossed borders. I guess the most difficult one, in a way, was crossing from the Republic of Ireland into Northern Ireland, and they still had machine guns at the border.
That must have been pretty...
It was a bit intimidating.
Yeah.
But as a Canadian solo on my bike, I don't think I was too much of a threat.
Yeah, they size it up pretty quick. And I imagine that searching, if they ever had to search a bicycle, it goes a lot quicker than searching a car.
Yeah, I think so. Now, I know last year when I crossed into Washington for probably just 100 kilometers, coming back into Canada, they were surprised that I just had two little tiny panniers and I was traversing the country on my bike. And they made me take everything out of my panniers. And I thought, well, this is a bit ridiculous, but okay, I will do it. And I think they were more curious to see how I could put all of my belongings for 74 days into two little panniers.
Yeah, I guess if you're in a zone in the world that laws really don't apply, they're like, hey, let's use that to our advantage and find out how this person actually...
Probably.
You know, I guess they're always looking for things that mean suspicious. Like if somebody's like, I'm coming to the country for, you know, a week and they have no luggage at all, that might be a tip-off that they're not telling the truth or something like that.
Perhaps.
I used to travel. I lived very close to the Canadian border in New York when I was a teenager, and we would frequently go up to Montreal.
Yes.
And crossing the border, it was a different experience depending on the direction you're going, obviously, because
Exactly.
different, you know, customs groups and stuff. But in a car, especially, and you can get a sense from this from the way my table is, not exactly the neatest person, so I would be like forgetting, you know, things in, you know, I never had anything illegal, but I was like, well, what if I forgot something that kind of looks suspicious, you know,
Exactly,
you know, do I have a Ziploc bag of flour, you know, or sugar? And, you know, from when I borrowed something, I don't know. It was always like all the nooks and crannies that something could be in.
Right.
Or just the time it would take for them to go through it if we had pulled over into secondary. I'm sure a bicyclist doesn't have to worry about that at all.
No, you try not to carry very much weight, or I do. I only carry usually about 25 pounds plus your water.
So you just recently completed a cross-Canada east to west tour? Or?
I did it a little bit differently. I found out about a group that was in central Canada, so in Sault Ste. Marie, which is on the Great Lakes. It's kind of at the juncture of Lake Huron and Lake Superior. So I found out about this group, and I thought, oh, it'd be kind of neat to cycle with a group to start off. So I did 400 kilometers with them, which wasn't very much, but it was wonderful. They were a lovely group. And then I gradually made my way to Newfoundland. And then from Newfoundland, after that, I took the plane out to Vancouver and cycled back to the Sioux. So I did coast to coast. A lot of people don't do, it's almost 9,000 kilometers.
Yeah.
And a lot of people don't do the entire coast to coast. Some people go from Calgary to Montreal, or from Vancouver to Montreal, or from, you know, the center of the country to Halifax. A lot of people end in Halifax. A lot of people don't go on to Newfoundland, but I wanted to do the whole thing. Yeah.
Is there a pretty considerable cycling culture in Canada? Is there a lot of people that do maybe not quite that long of a trip, but, you know, that because there is cycling, and I would say it's more of a regional thing in the United States. There's pockets of, you know, different parts of the country where cycling is bigger than elsewhere. But compared to Europe, I went to Amsterdam a couple years ago, and bicycles come before every other mode of transportation, even walking. You know, the bicycle comes first. And in other parts of Europe, there's still, the bicycle is seen as just as plausible of a way to get around as other modes of transportation. Is that true in Canada too, or is it because it's such a large, spread out geography that
Yeah.
there's a lot more auto traffic?
Well, firstly, I've cycled through around 30 countries, and my first trip in Europe included the Netherlands, which is beautiful for cycling, albeit the weather's not the best. But so their culture in pockets of Europe and the British Isles does lend itself to cycling, which is very similar to Canada. I'm from the East Coast. It's very hilly. We have narrow roads. We don't have the population, so most of people that cycle will cycle on back roads, country roads, and we're, kind of hardcore road cyclists, and some of us are touring cyclists. But if you were to go to an area that is perhaps more affluent and has a better infrastructure, some of the bigger cities, and even some of the cities around where I live, have a short commuting system that you can cycle through. So I find that most of the cities in Canada, the larger cities, do have a pretty good infrastructure for commuting. And that being said, cycling across the country, some of the areas around Winnipeg and Manitoba have an incredible cycling group, of which some of the people came out and met with me and cycled into town, into Winnipeg with me. So it depends where you're at. It depends on the topography.
Yeah.
There's not a lot of cyclists where I live, because you're going up a hill, you're going down a hill, and that's kind of your day. So if you don't like hills, you're not going to cycle there. And there's not too many cycling routes. So.
You touched on something that I think in the United States, obviously communities closer to the Canadian border have a better understanding of what's on the other side, because either we go there frequently or we have enough, maybe even pick up TV channels from either side of the border. And so you have a bit of local understanding of things. But Canada is not a mirror image of the United States, because most of the population is hugging pretty close to the Great Lakes and the southern part, whereas the northern reaches of Canada are far more frontier type environment, correct? It's not as many big cities and even infrastructure to the same degree as what you'd find in the lower parts of Canada.
Well, I would argue that yes, what you say is true about the larger cities, Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, being very close to the border. But we do have some cities, for example, Edmonton is very north in Alberta. Even in our area of the Maritimes, which comprises New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, PEI, and then the Atlantic provinces, which includes Newfoundland, we do have some larger cities.
Yeah.
And there's a good infrastructure there. We don't have the population, but post-COVID, we are getting more and more people moving to the Maritimes. So I wouldn't say the infrastructure isn't there. It's probably just a different type of infrastructure, and we get used to living within that different environment. And some of the areas are very remote, but you could go to a very remote area and end up in a city in Labrador that's very, very developed because of the mining that was in there, or different industry.
It extends my argument that everything is a primary source, even cities and other settlements, and reflecting of different time periods. And that's true across the world.
Yes,
I was talking with somebody the other day about cities in the eastern part of the United States usually have far more resemblance to earlier American history and even European feel to them because of when they were settled and how. And then you go further west and you're going to find much more modern cities with a real, genuine layout to them. And the infrastructure question, I think, is exactly bringing us to your selection for my table. I found this book about a month ago at a thrift store. And I just love the graphics on the cover of it. I thought it was really very mid-century, and it is. It's from the 1950s, and it's called It's a Big Country, America Off the Highways by Ben Lucien Berman. And the inside of it describes, it says, for many years, Ben Lucien Berman, who is constantly growing audience, is quote, America's greatest living interpreter, end quote, has been observing the men and women of those oddly diverse regions off the highways. Here is a vivid human panorama. He sets down these unknown peoples in all of the strangeness and picturesqueness. They resemble the frontiersmen of our early history, with lives full of drama and heroism, salted with rich native humor. This 1950s is a car-centric era. The interstate highways were an extension of the expressways that had been being built since the 1930s. These many-lane highways in either direction that were supposed to clear the congestion from the cities and allow for faster, more efficient travel. But this is a document that identifies something I'm sure you found to be absolutely true in your cycling travels, that the faster you go, the less that you see. When you have been journeying through Canada, do you see a similar kind of idea that was just expressed in the inside of this book of you get to meet the people, you get to know them, and you wouldn't if you were using a car?
Yes. Well, I think when you're on a bicycle, first of all, you have to accept the fact that you're not going to travel hundreds of kilometers a day. My longest trip through the mountains, anyways, was 218 kilometers in one day.
Wow.
And then my shortest, I don't know, depends on who I would meet that day, maybe 45 kilometers. I think that was probably the shortest. But some people that cycle across Canada cycle only on the Trans-Canada Highway. And I probably did 100 to 200 kilometers on the Trans-Canada because I had to. It was a necessity. I had no other routes. And that was through Western Canada. So what I endeavored to do was to stay off the primary roads. In British Columbia, when you're going through the Rocky Mountains, you don't have much of a choice. There were passes made through the mountains, and you really don't have much of a choice of how you're going to get through the mountains.
Yeah.
But I did choose the it's called the Crow's Nest Highway, and it skirts the southern part of British Columbia. And the reason I chose it was because it had less population. There were more mountain passes, and sometimes you were climbing 25, 27 kilometers, and then of course you got to go down the other side. But what was interesting there, and I didn't realize this until I did it, coming from the eastern seaboard of Canada, our history dates back to the Acadians, and before that, the Vikings. So we have a long history. But in Western Canada, I noticed that these towns had sprung up with the railroad in the late 1800s and the late 1900s, and the railroad was brought in my understanding, because of the gold rush coming through that area. So there were all of these little towns that, kind of tying in with your book, had sprung up because the railroad was there, and then they had died away because the railroad came in, they connected the towns, but then the gold left. The gold was depleted and the people moved on. So it was very interesting traveling through there. And then when I got into Alberta and into Saskatchewan and on to Manitoba, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, which weren't called the RCMP at the time, they actually walked from just outside of Winnipeg, Manitoba, to Fort Macleod, Alberta, partly because of the gold rush, partly because of the Wild West at the time. So they were sent out as a force, and their trail out is called the Redcoat Trail. And there is a highway that is extremely, extremely isolated that I traveled on, and it's called the Redcoat Trail. And you can take that through 3 provinces. And it's got a beautiful wide shoulder, but day after day I would see grasshoppers. It was a real drought, and there were a lot of grasshoppers this year. Sometimes I'd see a couple transport trucks. I became friends with some of the truck drivers who kind of watched me over, if they were traveling 400 kilometers back and forth hauling gravel or grain, they'd toot their horn. They start to toot their horn, and I got to know them. But very isolated areas, but also you see names of towns that no longer exist because the highway has moved from there to the Trans-Canada. And I think people that just want to get across Canada, a lot of them head to the Trans-Canada Highway, which is in my opinion, very, very dangerous. And some people may argue that cycling as a female alone through isolated areas is dangerous. But I never felt that danger, thank goodness. But I did feel a danger on the highway with big trucks and things
Right.
blowing off of trucks and travel trailers and that sort of thing. So it's interesting because you do touch upon those little tiny communities, and those ones that exist love to see tourists. I will say, and even in my travels overseas, if you go into an area where there's very few people that visit there, you're treated almost like a celebrity,
Yeah.
and you're welcomed into that community. And I think we have to keep that in mind if we're trying to keep our culture alive in these more remote areas.
It's you get that local feel that you wouldn't get otherwise.
Oh, yes.
And it's so I did a cross country road trip by my pickup truck a couple years ago with my family. Nice pickup truck, not a clunky thing going down the road. We went from New Hampshire to the Grand Canyon.
Nice.
And it was, what's interesting, what I find about this particular cover art, and I don't know who made it, if the author was consulted at all, but it's hard to tell if they're trying to depict the U.S. highways or the interstate highways. And in Canada, you were mentioning about the Trans-Canada Highway. Is that a multi-lane, 4 to 6 lanes across kind of highway, or is it more single?
Most of
each
it
way?
now is twinned, at least twinned. So you have 4 lanes. But in some of the larger cities, it gets much, much wider and bigger. I know when I crossed over it, what is it called, the 401, and I don't know if technically that's the Trans-Canada, but I crossed over top of that, and that was, I don't know, 10 lanes, so you're going over on a bridge, a footbridge that goes over it. So some areas are very large, but I'm not sure if that is actually considered the Trans-Canada. But coming out of large cities, we have multi-lane highways, which you don't want to be on.
Because I
a
was going to say,
bicycle.
I'm actually surprised that bicycles are permitted.
Oh, they aren't. They aren't.
Oh, they're not. Okay.
But some of them more, like I had to get on in Manitoba for about 200 kilometers, and some areas were just one lane, and then it was divided in some areas as well. So very, very small. And I'm sure I've never cycled up north. I stuck mainly to the lower area, but I've traveled there. And I'm not sure if the Trans-Canada actually is just one lane. Our major highway between the state of Maine and St. John, New Brunswick, is parts of it are just 2 lanes. You have traffic coming towards you, and they're trying to change that, but it's all about the economy.
Yeah, it's a tough. I mean, that's a big project to.
Oh, it's
widen
huge.
lanes.
It's huge.
And even for the highways that are meant for that. And the reason I ask is because when we traveled westward and then back east again, we mainly stuck to the interstates, the ones
Oh, really?
that this one is definitely a reaction to, because it was just, we were trying to cover as much time, ground as possible. And looking back on it, even during the trip, we were kind of kicking ourselves because we could only stay in towns and cities for a few hours, and then we had to get back on the road to get to the next stop on our map. And a few times we would hit the secondary roads. So in the United States in the late 1920s, about 1927 is when Congress passed the Highway Act, which was to create the U.S. highway routes, and those are the ones, like around here we have Route 1 that
Yes.
goes from the top of Maine all the way down to Florida, and it goes across the country, and in California they have the 101, which goes right along the coast. And then in the 1950s, even, so states had been building their own highways. Connecticut had a turnpike, Pennsylvania had a turnpike. They were exploring the idea of these big, kind of like the German Autobahn, big highways that could handle several lanes at a time. Dwight D. Eisenhower, when he was president, signed the Interstate Highway Act and incorporated all of them into this big system.
Right.
And so and while we were traveling out west, that's when we would go on and off of the famed US 66. So
Right.
66 goes from Chicago to LA and is the storied Mother Road, but a lot of it is gravel. It's not even really drivable. Definitely not by lots of cars at a time. And it just is to me, it's always a reflection of how quickly the automobile age developed, because we traveled when we were going from Oklahoma to Arizona. We were on I-40, which is parallel to Route 66. Just like I-95 is parallel to Route 1, I-40 goes right next to 66. And we could watch, and 66 has all those fun gas stations and diners and
Right.
businesses with the neon signs, and very Americana, very mid-century Americana. Does Canada have similar kind of roadside attractions the same way that I'm describing, that you can only see when you go on the secondary roads, that the Trans-Canadian Highway does not have at all? Because on the interstates you have rest areas. You can get off of those, and they're really nothing to see. They're very modern. And they will have maybe exits to different communities, and it's the same thing. You got McDonald's and Burger King and Wendy's all in the same spot. But there's really no local flavor to it. Is that similar in Canada in your travels, that the main highway doesn't have much as far as culture? It's the secondary ones that really
Yes, and I think that's what I was speaking to. You have to get onto your secondary roads. And as we know, and what you've just described, not everybody does that. I would argue that a very small percentage of the population actually get off the Trans-Canada Highway. And the Trans-Canada Highway parallels what you spoke to. You pull off, there's a rest stop. You pull off, you fuel up, you have some fast food and get on again. And I tend not to travel that way worldwide, because I think it's very important to get off and discover the culture that's there. Are there gas stations, very Americana? No, we're not the United States, so it's very different. But you would go into a small town. You would probably be welcomed by people in the town, and I've had those opportunities. Had a couple incidents happen, and people have backed me up and supported me. So you go into a small town, there might be a local restaurant, there might be, people have taken me for tours in their churches or around their facilities to show me their little town. And I think people are very willing to do that. But we have to take that journey off of the beaten path. If we really want to know what the culture is in Canada or in the United States or anywhere in the world, we have to get off and not want to just go there and check all the boxes.
It's very revealing of the values of the majority of the culture in any time where time is the most valuable thing.
Oh, yes.
Right? And that's why somebody would be willing to take a car on a major highway, because they're, I'll spend more time when I get to my place, but the journey is not what I'm interested in taking care of. I want to get that done as fast as possible so I can get wherever I'm going and whatever that looks like. And we can see the value system in travel through history, like you were saying. Those places in the western parts of Canada that were products of the railroad age, there wasn't a lot of leisure that was bringing them people there. They were on vacation, and this book refers to the how it's reflective of the frontiersmen of early history and their lives full of drama and heroism. They weren't going to the western part of the country for relaxation. They weren't there because, in fact, that topic probably didn't enter their head except for maybe a couple days out of the year where they could rest from their chores and their jobs around their homesteads and things. So it's these roadways have, kind of embedded in them so many different ideas, attitudes, values that span a timeline just as much as they span the country.
And I would argue with that if we think back to pre-colonialism, most indigenous cultures were settling along river sources because that was their mode of transportation. And if we look to the east of the United States and of Canada, most of our towns have been settled alongside the rivers because we were using waterways as our transportation method. And I argue that getting on those old roads and visiting those small towns is also much more beautiful than taking the main highway and going across at a lightning speed, right? My motto is it's about the journey and not the destination. Mm-hmm. So yes, I wanted to get, in my 9,000 kilometers and traverse the country, but I also wanted to enjoy myself along the way. It was really about the journey for me and learning about people along the way, and not just getting to where I was going. And I would love to see more people do that.
Well, it's
especially more women.
I think we're going back to that. There's more people that, and thanks in large part to organizations that make it their mission to highlight. I don't know if you've ever. There's this wonderful website called Atlas Obscura.
No.
And they specialize, and it's crowdsourced a lot of times where users of the website will supply their own roadside or off the beaten path attractions. They'll submit something like there's a memorial marker dedicated to something you've never heard of, and you have to take this route. So it's not. It's not Mount Rushmore. They're not. That's not going to be an Atlas Obscura. The Statue of Liberty is not going to be on Atlas Obscura. Those are well known. It's things that you wouldn't expect, and they've even gone off into a gastronomic Atlas Obscura, where it's food places that you would otherwise bypass. And so there is a return to that. There is segments of our population that value the journey more than the destination and enjoy. Yeah, we have time. We can go do, because that's why we are traveling, is to see new things and to go off the path. And we can even use that as a cutoff point, too, that you can definitely see there was a distinct era, like you say, with people settling along necessities. Like we need water, not only for travel, but for life, food source and water source, all those things, that there is a cutoff somewhere around, and I would argue maybe the early 20th century.
Yeah, I would argue that too.
Definitely World War II is when we go from, and the roadways are connecting those places when they weren't connected before, but that's also the same time period that transitions our perception too. As collectively as humans, we are like, all right, we're done with that age of settling along necessities. Now we can go wherever we want at any time. Let's do it. And again, it turns into, it's not the journey, it's the destination. But I'm glad to hear that there's other folks who see it, more and more as, and you have, because you are doing so much yourself on a bicycle, that's when everything is that much more seen. Because you're going so much slower than what a car would do.
Especially with the headwind.
But I am still super impressed that you could cover that many kilometers in one day. I couldn't even do 3 probably, but that's just because I'm not an avid cyclist.
Never say never. You never know. And I would encourage women to get out and do it as well. I've been doing it for many years and don't publicize it for the mere fact I think we are more vulnerable and we have to take extra precautions. I don't stealth camp. I make sure that I end up in a campground at night, or there's also a couple of organizations to whom I belong that welcome cyclists into their homes, and I'm actually staying with somebody here that's part of that organization, and they're they're also a university professor here, so I didn't find that out until I got here. But they are part of a cycling organization, and that provides some security to people that are cycling alone. Not that I feel I need that security, but if you do need it, it's there. So I would encourage women to do it. Be safe about it. Don't put it all over Facebook. Don't put it all over social media, because that's not safe. But it's certainly an incredible way to travel. And like I said, I've hauled my family. I was a single mom and hauled my family through lots of different countries and on a bicycle or hiking. And it's slower, but sometimes the best journeys that you have are not those you seek. And people come into your life that will change your life. Just, you meet them in a little tiny town. If I may, I'd like to tell a story.
Sure.
A couple of stories.
No, time's up. I'm just kidding.
Okay. I was cycling through southern Saskatchewan, and I'm Acadian, French-speaking, from the eastern seaboard of Canada. And we've been there. Actually, the Cajuns are Acadians that left, as you know, and went down to the New Orleans area. But I had heard that there was and I knew that there were a lot of French communities in southern Saskatchewan, and people said, "Oh, no, there's no French, but I looked at names like La Flèche and Gravelbourg, and I thought, these have to be French communities at one point. And so I headed south along the Red Coat Trail, and I had several days of 40 degrees Celsius headwind, grasshoppers, no tree to hide under when you're in the middle of the prairies, and winds, often headwinds or crosswinds, but mainly, it was windy and very rarely tailwind. And I pedaled into a small town that only had a gas station and it was a tumbleweed town, and met an older gentleman and a girl there, and she was working. He had gone in to pick up some hardware stuff. So I went to the next town, and it was called La Flèche, and got into town, and lo and behold, this gentleman's walking across the road, and I was going to the co-op. And he talked to me, and he said, "Would you like to go out to dinner?" And I said, he was about 75, and I said, "Sure, I'll go out." I said, "I'm often alone, cooking by my tent." Yeah. And so I popped into the co-op and got ready the night, and off we went to dinner. Well, because I had been cycling day after day in this stifling heat, and then popping into wherever I saw, or hiding behind gravestones to get some shade. Oh my goodness. I was dehydrated, and I realized that night. And although I had been consuming a lot of electrolytes and a lot of water and popsicles and orange juice and everything like that, I was dehydrated. And he drove me in to, I had his number, and the next morning he drove me into Gravelbourg to the hospital, and waited for me. And then he drove me back into town. And in the meantime, through an organization, the cycling organization, I was going to stay with a lady 400 kilometers down the road in another little town called Arcola. And she said, "I know people in La Flèche. We'll get you a hotel room for the night." So in this little tiny community, from another little tiny community 400 kilometers away, I was put into a hotel room for the night. And didn't have to tent because I was dehydrated. And I just thought, wow, isn't that neat? That's just a really pay it forward, reciprocate experience. And then I was cycling through Ontario, like 2,000 kilometers later, and there's an area that's very, very isolated. And I was nervous going through it because there's a lot of Indigenous women and missing and murdered Indigenous women through that area. And I was nervous. I knew day after day it wasn't flat like the prairies. There were a lot of trees. There was a lot of places that I could be taken off the road. And I get a phone call from this gentleman in the flesh. And he said, I've been thinking about you. And I said, okay. And he said, I think I'll bring my car and I'm going to follow you through there.
Oh.
So I know he wanted the adventure too.
Yeah.
And here's this 75-year-old man that drives across, an eighth of Canada to follow me for 5 days or whatever until I get to an area that's more safe. And I mean, he had fun. We had a lot of fun. It was something that was out of the norm for him. But what a great experience for him to and I to do that. He wasn't biking, he was driving his car, but he was like my bodyguard. So it was kind of neat. It was a really exciting.
And that would not have happened had it not been for you recognizing the relationship potentially of having Acadian extensions into that knowledge that you had of.
Yes. The French communities through southern Saskatchewan and through southern Manitoba. There's a lot of people that still speak French there and come from French communities that have huge, massive Catholic churches, which we tend to build, and little tiny homes.
And those are usually associated just with lower Canada, like the Quebec and eastward from there.
It's exactly. The Roman Catholic.
Right. And everything else is Anglo and is
but southern
British,
southern Saskatchewan, southern Manitoba, and New Brunswick, of course, I would encourage people to go to if they want to see some of those big churches in French culture. We have a lot of fun French culture, and actually, also in southern Saskatchewan, somebody said, you should pop into, they call it Forget, but it's Forget, and it's a little tiny town of 45 people, and I said, sure. And there was a large church there, and there used to be a school, a large private school for boys and girls. And I stopped at the manse, and a lady that was 85, she was so put together, and she said, yes, we've always had concerts here, music. And she said, but the building we owned, it burnt down, but I encourage you to go to the Red House. And I thought, okay, I'll pop over to the Red House. And there were people out in the backyard jamming, and I play Celtic music, and I'm a step dancer, and my son plays the fiddle. So they said, come on in, and they were sitting out back, and we had friends in common. I know fiddlers from Western Canada, and they knew people from Eastern Canada. So we jammed. We jammed all afternoon and spoke French and English, and had a couple drinks.
Probably the most North American possible thing you could have done is all of what you're just describing. These are incredible stories. And I think that had you been, in the 1950s, what compelled this guy to write this book?
He was probably a kindred spirit.
Right. Kind of like, let's not forget and let's notice what's still here to remind us. And it sounds like we were talking before we hit record that you're like, you've been, kind of people have been telling you should start a podcast or write a book or something like that.
Yes.
I think you have it. I think this needs to be documented somewhere, and if nothing else, just so that you can know that somebody could be hearing it and getting inspiration from what you have to say.
My grandchildren someday.
And that's, I years ago, I talked with some a teacher, colleague of mine. He was a much older man, and I said, I've been thinking about writing a book someday, and he just said very simply, so leaving your mark.
Yes.
Like, yeah, that's what it's all about, and I'm sure that the story you just told is remembered by the people that were involved in it.
Oh, I'm pretty sure.
They see it, and I'm sure they tell it very similarly, from their perspective, and you put that all together, and you have yourself a history, right, a document, and so I encourage you.
Thank you.
To do it as well.
I may reach out to you.
Well, you have my information. So
I do.
Thank you so much for taking the time, and I really appreciate it.
Thank you for taking the time. I appreciate it as well.
Have a great rest of your conference and safe journeys, however you go about it. Right?
Okay. Thanks, Eric.